I see myself on two screens. Am I okay?
Leader Esdale, you are live, so whenever you're ready to deliver your opening remarks.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Scott Easdale.
Greetings. Hello, everyone. My name is Scott X. Esdale, and I'm the chairman of the National Criminal Justice Committee. And I'm also the state president of the Connecticut NAACP. And I'd like to give greetings on behalf of the entire Connecticut NAACP, including all of our youth and adult units. On behalf of the National Criminal Justice Committee, our national chairman, Leon Russell, and your friend and mine, our president and CEO, President Derek Johnson, we salute all the delegates, alternates, and observers of the NAACP's 112th convention. When I was told that I would be given the opportunity to give the greetings before the Race and Justice Criminal Justice panel, I asked myself, what could I say that would be extremely inspirational to the delegates from all across this nation? What would our forefathers and our ancestors want me to say? And immediately it popped in my mind, and our iconic NAACP giant that came to my mind, it was the late, great Dr. Benjamin Hooks. I'm going to speed this up so I don't take up too much time. But first, I will share some words from Dr. Benjamin Hooks because he was one of my favorite speakers of all times. He shared this story with us at our NAACP 100th anniversary. He said that the mice were having a meeting about organizing to do some civil rights work, but they could not organize because there was a great big cat, and the big cat would eat them all up if he caught them organizing. The mice were trying to figure out what they should do. One of the young mice stood up and said, what we need to do is to put a bell on the big cat's tail. So when the cat comes around, the bell will make a noise. And then we could all get away safely. They all said, what a wonderful idea, such a wonderful idea. And the older mouse stood up and said, that's a great idea, but who is going to put the bell on the cat's tail? Dr. Hooks said since 1909, when the NAACP was founded, that was the job of the NAACP. Whether facing the big cat of lynching, the cat of unequal pay, the cat of white mob violence, the big cat of crooked police and corrupt cops, the big cat of voter suppression, the cat that tried to stop us from serving in the armed forces. The NAACP had to fight the big cat of housing discrimination and unequal education. We fought the segregated restaurants, hotels, bathrooms, and the cat that made us sit in the back of the bus. We have been fighting against the big cat of racism every day of our existence. Dr. Hooks said the NAACP is the mouse that belled the cat. He said not only has the NAACP belled the cat, but in many situations we had to kill the cat. He said the NAACP are not mice. We are strong men and strong women. And the big bad cat represents evil everywhere. I won't read the entire speech, but today I don't have to write a new speech. Our ancestors and our forefathers have already laid out the blueprint. They have already given us our marching orders. For 112 years, we fought against the KKK and other white supremacist groups. We had to fight against the lynching and the burning of crosses on our front lawns. It was the domestic terrorism that we fought then, and it's the domestic terrorism we are fighting now. And it's the NAACP's duty and responsibility to fight against what took place in January 6, 2021 in Washington, D.C. And I'm glad to say that our president and CEO, Derek Johnson, is in the front of the fight. The criminal justice system has not been our friend. It's never been a friend of ours. Misconduct from the police, police brutality, prosecutorial misconduct, prison gerrymandering, in which the NAACP in Connecticut just abolished, and the government just signed the abolishment of prison gerrymandering in the state of Connecticut. Mass incarceration must go. We must continue to fight against mass incarceration. But in the spirit of Dr. Hooks, we must rally up the troops and continue to fight the fight. We must continue to bell the cat and bring justice to our people. It ain't nothing new. We have been doing it for 112 years. So let's listen to our panel. Let's take the information that they have prepared for us and let's get fired up and ready to go. And let's go back into our communities and make our ancestors and our forefathers proud of us. Let's go back and bell the cat. God bless you all, and please continue to enjoy the NAACP's 112th National Convention. We will now go to our good freedom fighter, our strong freedom fighter for the national staff, Mr. Jamel Watkins. Peace.
Good evening, NAACP family. Thank you, Leader Esdale, for your words and your opening charge. We all know and love the leader known by the name Mr. Benjamin Hooks, and we understand that the dialogue we're about to have this evening is critically important based upon where we are, not only in our nation's history, but where we are as a community, as a people, and as a nation. So I have the job of literally shepherding a powerful conversation with some of our friends and allies. And I'm going to take a few minutes to introduce what I consider to be a dynamic cast of strong women who are going to represent this dialogue around policing, criminal justice reform, and therefore what, as we continue to have this conversation. So I'm not going to read the full bios of all of the panelists, but I'm going to give you a snapshot of who you will be hearing from in conversation so that as we're going through the conversation, you'll know how powerfully we're being represented in terms of the dialogue we're having this evening. So our first panelist is none other than Linda R. Williams, who is not only a professor, but president of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. Ms. Williams serves as the 43rd national president of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. Now, she's proud, and I'm going to say this again, she is very proud that she has the honor of being a professor at her alma mater, which is Middle Tennessee State University, in the Department of Criminal Justice Administration. Now, she was the first to hold this title, really in recognition of the breadth and depth of her knowledge and expertise in the field of criminal justice and executive security. Now, prior to this, she had a strong and sort of storied history in the Department of Criminal Justice Administration, where she served as a subject matter expert on foreign and domestic terrorism, criminal justice processes, community and public service engagement, and executive law enforcement. And her career as a veteran of the United States Secret Service from 1988 until her retirement in 2017 really allowed for her to develop her thought leadership and her ability to really lean in on what we're going to be dialoguing about this evening. She maintains a strong presence in community and community service organizations as a member of Women in Federal Law Enforcement, a part of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, a part of the National Council of Negro Women. She also is, my soror. She's an active member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. I'm an Alpha, she's an AKA, and we're really excited that we will be hearing from President Williams in this dialogue. Alongside President Williams, we will hear from Jerica Richardson, who serves as Senior Vice President for Equitable Justice and Strategic Urban League. Now, y'all, that's a title. That's a long title. That means there's a lot of work that Jerica is responsible for at the Urban League. She leads the organization's advocacy, public education, and strategic work on civic engagement, police reform, criminal justice reform, and other justice-related areas. Now, prior to this role, Ms. Richardson was Deputy Executive Director and Senior Advisor and Secretary to the board for the nation's largest independent police oversight agency, the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board. She has also served as Chief of Staff in the Office of the Counsel to the Mayor of New York City and Special Advisor to the Mayor for Media Relations, Criminal Justice, and Public Safety. And before working in City Hall, she was the senior spokesperson for the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York and a field producer and off-air reporter for ABC News. Ms. Richardson holds a JD from the University of Michigan Law School and a BA in English from Spelman College. And she too is also a proud member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. Our other panelist who is joining us this evening is attorney and judge Glenda Hatchett. Now, you all know Judge Hatchett, but I don't know if you all know that she was born in the great state of Georgia. And given her work and her tenure, you know, she started off earning a BA in political science from Mount Holyoke College in 1973. And she was a distinguished alumni and ordered an honorary degree in 2000 by the college. She attended Emory University School of Law, where she received her Juris Doctorate degree in 1977. And after graduating from law school, she had a coveted federal clerkship for the United States District Court in the Northern District of Georgia, followed by a position at Delta Airlines. At Delta, she became the airline's highest ranking woman of color worldwide by serving both as a senior attorney and public relations manager. In 1990, Hatchett left this position to be the chief presiding judge of the Fulton County, Georgia Juvenile Court. Now, when she accepted this position, she became Georgia's first African-American chief presiding judge of a state court and the department head of one of the largest juvenile court systems in the country. In 2000, when she left this position, she began presiding over the nationally syndicated television show Judge Hatchett, which taped regular episodes for 8 seasons and is now in its 6th year of national syndication, including the Best of Judge Hatchett on WeTV. Presently, Judge Hatchett has been active as a board member for the Atlanta Falcons football organization, serves on the board of advisors for Play Punks International, serves on the board and Boys and Girls Club of America National Board of Governors. And on July 11, 2016, something very powerful, her law firm announced that they would be representing the family of Philando Castile in all civil matters. And our fourth and final panelist is Jennifer Lewinsky, an activist and founder of Asbury Park Transformative Justice Project. Jennifer is an abolitionist, an anti-oppression activist, an advocate, and an educator uplifting Black femmes and the formerly incarcerated. Jennifer primarily works from her hometown of Asbury Park with groups that fight for fair housing, food and shelter, for homeless folks, anti-gentrification, anti-racism, and cooperative economics. In 2017, with 2 others, she formed the Asbury Park Transformative Justice Project, which seeks to reform the way we view crime, punishment, rehabilitation, and how we care for all who have been harmed by violence, be it systematic, interpersonal, or some other form. Now, I told you this is going to be a dynamic group. These 4 amazing women are really going to help us unpack the notion of structural discrimination and unjust policing and prosecution and practices that literally unfairly impact Black communities. You see, we're trying to focus on how do you build a just system that urgently demands reform. And so we're going to talk about race and justice, the ways that discrimination, policing, prosecution, and incarceration practices impact Black communities. So we're going to start off by hearing from our panelists one by one. And I'm going to turn to President Williams to open us up and to set the stage from her perspective on the issues that we are tackling in this conversation. President Williams, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. I do bring you greetings on behalf of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, NOBLE. I am honored to be sitting among greatness. I've had the opportunity to be with Judge Hatchett as she moderated our CEO symposium and all these other great women for such a time as this. I am proud to serve as the 43rd National President when I was stalled over a year ago. You know, first and foremost, we were challenged with the global pandemic that provided a different landscape in which to govern. And then we were catapulted into where we are now upon the murder of George Floyd. So for a time such as this, it wasn't time any longer to sit on the sideline. NOBLE has been relevant since its inception in 1976. We celebrating our 45th anniversary as we serve as the conscience of law enforcement by being committed to justice by action. What does that look like? We call out the inequities. We call out the ills in our society. And you have to challenge these. Even when I came in as president last summer, one of my first conversations out the gate was with the AG Barr. He made the conversation that, you know, systemic racism does not exist. You know, and I said in all due respect, just because one has not experienced such does not negate its existence. So I have continually used my platform as noble as we have crossed the lines in the energy sector, the entertainment, financial sector, because this is a human problem. It doesn't just stop just because, you know, the skin color of the people that are being abused, but our whole global world has changed, and we're looking front and center at this stage. And so we have to use our voices united to be that voice of change. And this is more than just a moment. This is a movement, because as they say, and I said so wellly from the South, a change is going to come. But we know there's chaos before there is change. And so we have to continue to use our unified voices, our strength, and our energy to not settle and call out these illness in our society in order to make it a better day, that 10 years from now, that our children are not sitting here fighting these same cause. So I'm excited to sit here with these great women to get into a dynamic conversation. And again, thank you for having me.
Thank you, President Williams, for those opening remarks. Next, we're going to turn to Senior Vice President Jerica Richardson from the National Urban League.
Good evening, and thank you for that warm introduction, Jamal. It's an honor to be here at the NAACP's 112th National Convention alongside tonight's distinguished speakers. I serve as the Senior Vice President for Equitable Justice and Strategic Initiatives at the National Urban League. And since 1910, the League has been working to lift barriers to opportunity for Black people, people of color, and other marginalized communities in this country. We are honored and proud to be part of this civil rights movement, fighting alongside our partners like the NAACP. As Senior Vice President of my division, I oversee a wide portfolio of issues for the League. We build teams, coalitions, and tools to help society reimagine and redefine policing and the broader criminal justice system, among other areas. In April, we launched our 21 Pillars for Redefining Public Safety and Restoring Community Trust, and have spent the past several months working with community partners, as well as governmental and non-governmental partners, to push the needle forward beyond reforming the system and toward restructuring it. When we developed our plan for redefining public safety, we approached it from a people-first perspective, recognizing that policing Black people and poor people in America has always been the entryway into the criminal justice system, feeding a revolving door of injustice in a system that has deep roots in slavery, Black codes, Jim Crow laws, and has ballooned into mass incarceration. This is the effect of an unjust system. So we must acknowledge that there are costs and burdens associated with this unjust system. And the cost is lives lost, freedom stolen, potential which has been stifled, and legacies that have been crushed. How can we move forward if you are unwilling to see your past? America is afraid to look in the mirror, and it's because mirrors reflect everything behind you. To look in the mirror is to face yourself and all that came before you. Our movement is that mirror. So what is our path forward? The reality is that there are over 18,000 police departments in this country, each operating within a local, statewide, and national system, all with their own culture of policing. And court systems are layered sky high as well. So though we talk about the system as one entity, these are systems within systems within systems. Within each of these systems, we are arrested, killed by police, and sentenced to harsher terms more often, and then surveilled by the system more often, even after release from prison via the parole supervision system. If America truly looked in the mirror, it could not ignore how ugly the truth is. So we're here today to frame issues and talk solutions. At the League, when we developed our 21 pillars, we start with empowering communities to engage, and we talk about community investment. To be clear, when we say community investment, we're not asking for a handout. We are demanding that you make us whole for what was stolen and unwind this cycle. Our plan discusses police accountability in the courtroom by ending qualified immunity and preventing police unions and law enforcement Bill of Rights from blocking justice for police misconduct. It emphasizes uprooting policing policies that toxify the culture, use of force policies, no-knock warrants, chokeholds, shooting at moving vehicles, and so on. It requires transparency and reporting via data collection on police misconduct and use of force and body-worn camera implementation. And finally, we discussed hiring, training, police accreditation, and decertification to build the kind of public safety offices that meet the needs of the people they serve and protect. So if I could boil our call to action down into 2 words, they would be pressure and action. In order to bend the moral arc of the universe towards justice, we must always apply pressure. And we are at a critical moment in history and in our movement to do just that. Thank you so much for having me here this evening.
No, thank you, Leader Richardson, for laying that out. Now, the next voice you will hear from is no stranger to applying pressure, none other than Judge Glenda Hatchett. Judge Hatchett, the floor is yours for opening comments.
Thank you very much. I feel like I'm in church, and so just amen. Thank you for the privilege. People have been thanking me for doing this today, but it really is my privilege. It is my responsibility. And I thank each of these dynamic women for working and doing what you do. And I am learning from you in this process. If I may, I want to set the stage of a little bit of legal history that has gotten us to this point, if I may. I'll share with you. And people see me as a TV judge. I have a national law firm, as you talked about, Jamal. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And I did that because I think it's important for me at this part in my life to step beyond the bench and to advocate for things that I believe in. And so I did take on the Philando Castile case in Minnesota. And I will tell you, and most people are really, really shocked when I say this, that there had never been a police officer in the history of the entire state of Minnesota had ever been indicted, ever, in that case. Ever. And so that was a huge piece of them saying that we've never done it. I went all the way up to Loretta Lynch, who was then, of course, Attorney General, got the U.S. Department of Justice to open a 3-year investigation because Philando Castile was only 32 years old. He had been stopped more than 50 times in a small suburb outside of Minnesota. And so the Hatchett firm is based in Atlanta, but I've been taking on these cases nationwide because, again, I feel strongly that this is what my work should be. Purposely, and I'm going to get into the legal history in 2 seconds here because I want to be mindful of the time, but I want to share with you, over my shoulder, there are artist renditions that were beautifully made of a human heart that is actually wide open. And the reason they're done that way is because the bullet that literally took Philando's life, although several were fired, the fatal bullet literally ripped his heart and his heart was exploded open. And so that is my constant reminder. It's right near the front entrance of my door because I don't think we can ever forget, and I cannot express my gratitude for the work that we all are trying to collectively do. But let me just take just a few minutes, I mean, not even a few minutes, a few seconds to talk about the legal history that brings us to where we are in this country. We can't really talk about the pending legislation and the reform that needs to happen, Jamal, unless we are looking clearly at what happened in the 60s. In 65, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down, actually in 65 and in 69, 2 cases. Because people always say, well, why can't they be shot in the leg or in the shoulder? Those Supreme Court decisions gave police the authority to use lethal force if they felt threatened or if someone else's life was at risk, in their opinion. And that has opened the door to a lot of decisions that really have put more and more and more. We know that Black people will be 5 times more at risk of being shot and killed by police. I looked at a study recently I want to share with you too that was done in 2020 that they were talking about how few death certificates have the cause of death being at the hands of a police officer. We saw that in George Floyd case. The preliminary report came out I actually did a training session for medical examiners in some 90 countries recently, and I said, unless you're going to be honest about it, I know I'm all over the place. I want to get all of those little pieces in here because we can't understand the qualified immunity, what's happening, and what the legislation has to be, as well as the Supreme Court's decision that really are going to bring about a collective systematic reform. Lastly, I will tell you that in this legislation that is pending now before Congress, that if we don't get that passed, we are going to be in serious trouble. Right now, and I know President Williams will confirm this, right now there is no national database. I can use force, I can get away with it, and then I can go and move to a different police department, and they will never know what happened in the original city. And until we find funding tied to police conduct, until we have federal funding tied to a mandate for body cams, until we have federal funding that requires databases being done systematically and not voluntarily, we will continue to see the problems that we're having in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Hatchett, for setting the table, if you will. Now we're going to hear from our last panelist with her opening remarks, Leader Jennifer Lewinsky.
Good evening, and thank you so much for the invitation. I'm flattered and amazed to be sitting on a panel with such esteemed women. There is a lot of different ways that we look at justice and criminal justice, and a lot of different ways that we discuss it. And as you mentioned, I do work grassroots. I work on the ground and in the community, door to door. And one of the most important things to me is to start to reimagine the way that we think about justice and what crime means and why things become a crime, right? Because it's very difficult to explain to someone who was brought up in the kind of cognitive dissonance that happens in the American education system that you need to unlearn everything that you believe is correct in order to correct something that is incorrect. It doesn't make logical sense when you put it all together like that. So you have to, we start at the very beginning and we discuss all of these different systems because they all come together, all the way from settler colonialism to manifest destiny to when prisons began to when they became mass incarceration, and how all of that connects to capitalism and global politics, right? So there's all of these different systems that come together and create oppressive systems that we are comfortable with and we continue to use. So when you say I'm an abolitionist, yes, I absolutely am an abolitionist. I understand that reform needs to happen, but I also think that our communities can learn to not utilize men with guns because our neighbor's music is too loud, right? So there's a way to undo some of the cognitive dissonance that's built into American life so that police can go about the business of policing and communities can go on about the business of being community without coming together and clashing in the way that we do. So I'm really talking about, well, what we do at my nonprofit is really talk about what justice actually is. And in most cases, that looks like resources, right? A lot of crime happens, a great plenty of crime happens because of the lack of resources, and that is by design from a larger system that needs to be tackled in a different way. So you will find in writings that I've written and speeches that I've given that I am not a reformist. I don't necessarily believe that reform is going to happen in a real way, because I believe that the system is working exactly as it's designed to work. And how then do you reform something that's doing what it's supposed to do? It doesn't need to be fixed. It's not broken. It's exactly what it was meant to be. What we need to do is find our own system and work outside of it and build something else and do something different. And it sounds complicated and big, but it's really not. Abolition is really just about getting to the business of helping each other deal with our trauma and the way that we react to our trauma and what happens when we hurt each other, and understanding that punishment is not the way to true justice. So hopefully we'll fit that into the conversation somewhere. Thank you again so much for having me.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that. Now, you actually opened up the conversation that we really want to get into. In the Black community, we know that we push advancements, a monolith. You got Republicans, you got Democrats, you got folks in between that look just like us. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about this notion of policing, there's a group of folks probably on one end of the spectrum that says, it's not broken, leave it alone. And then there's another group of folks on the other end of the spectrum that says the entire system needs to be thrown away. So I want to throw that out there to the panelists. Sort of, what do you say to the community around how we start to address these issues, given that you can fall along any parts of this spectrum, but we all want something different? And so I'm going to open it up to each one of you, and I'll actually start with you, President Williams, and then I would love to hear from all of the panelists about this notion of to defund and to get rid of the system, or to reform it and, sort of tinker with it to make it better. What do you say?
So one of my agenda items was police reform. I had a task force entitled Reimagining Public Safety. So what does that look like? The bottom line is the goal is accountability and transparency. Noble is consistent of law enforcement from every walk, from the municipalities, from state, federal, and even practitioners. So Noble is always called to be seated with others, but I took the task and that we'll set our own table. We'll have that entree. Over half of the major city chief and executives out of those 18,000 departments are members of Noble. Noble started out as a premier African-American organization, but today our membership extends across from all walks. So anyone that's here with the mantra that we are here to serve our communities, to be guardians and not warriors. And so when we talk about reimagining public safety, she is exactly right. The system is what it was designed to do. But however, the very history of law enforcement started with slave patrols. So that has permeated throughout and what it is today. And so we have to call for that accountability and transparency. We have to have national legislation that governs all law enforcement, not that it's set at the auspices or the discretion of some police chief, because a larger department is operated differently from a smaller one. But you have to have that same standard, that same training, that accountability and consequences when people do not adhere to that. We talk about there's an over-reliance of police, and it is because that's how our society did it. But when we look at reform, and even that word that everybody jumps back from of defunding, well, if you ask my college students, they say, yeah, get away, let's do away with the police. But we know realistically, we cannot live in a lawless society. But if you ask me and my peers, we look at it like, let's reappropriate. Let's look at it at a holistic approach that, law enforcement are not and supposedly shouldn't be answering every call. So now we got to align with the social services, the mental illness, the homelessness, the drugs, and all of these things, so that when we are still engaging the community, that we're softening our footprint, but bringing those other experts there to help that. And this shouldn't be dependent on the economic status of a community, that everyone is a human being and they're not to be dehumanized. And that's why you can treat us as such. But we have to call it out and have those standards. Like George has to say, that national database that you can go from one department to another and you don't know it. And we're not talking about that you're late coming into the station. We're talking about those egregious acts, those acts that, violate constitutional rights. So we have to have a standard of training. We have to have a standard of accountability. We have to have consequences. And if we talk about refunding, let's reappropriate that funding and associate it with when a department is not meeting that caliber. Or, when we talk about money, if you start hitting people's pocket, then it gets their attention. So it's a holistic approach, and it takes more than just law enforcement to fix itself. It takes the legislation, it takes all the community leaders, social and academia, which were all part of this task force. And I invite you to come to our website and look at that report because it is pivotal. And the difference is it does not just get statistical data, it gives actionable, sustainable recommendations that are applicable because like Jennifer said, if we keep doing the same thing the same way, we're going to get the same results. So unified and uniquely, we have to go in and collaboratively speak to these injustices so that we can change the way that things are being done.
Thank you for that. Jerica, what are your thoughts?
Well, thank you for that. I think Ms. Williams laid out and touched on so many of the important issues. And I hear Ms. Lewinsky and what she's talking about with respect to abolition. As a former journalist, I think sometimes we all recognize that words have power, but there are moments when we can kind of get caught up in semantics. In many ways, and just hearing both of them, hearing the point about investment in our communities and in social services, and then even when Ms. Lewinsky is talking about abolition, the thread that ties them together is communities, putting communities first and putting community at the table in a way that it hasn't been done. I get uncomfortable using the term reform because we've talked about reform administration after administration. And right now, after what we experienced in 2020 with this pandemic and multiple pandemics, reform just doesn't feel strong enough. It feels like we're tinkering around the edges when we use that term. So I agree with Ms. Williams in the term reimagining. One of the things that the Urban League, we are really focused on in the term of art that we use is redefining, because what exists now just is not sustainable. We really have to move into a culture of accountability so that irrespective of whether you make the laws or you break the laws or you're charged with enforcing the laws, you will be held accountable for your actions. And quite frankly, I feel like the community doesn't always feel like lawmakers are moving, and that often there is a crisis in consciousness and there's a crisis in courage in getting this national reform passed. You know, getting this national legislation, we need national standards. Judge Hatchett pointed that out earlier today. It should not matter where you live. It should not matter whether you're in Harlem or New Hampshire, that you should expect the same consequences and repercussions if you are experiencing police misconduct. And right now, we have a broken system where we don't see equity, we don't see national standards, and that really it's a roll of the dice depending on who you are, what color you are, or where you live about the outcomes. So I think there's much work that we need to do, but I am hopeful as long as we all on this spectrum keep community first.
Thank you for that. Now Judge Hatchett, want to hear your thoughts on this question.
Listen, I'm telling you, I'm just sitting here trying not to say amen and, keeping my mic muted. I could not agree more that where we are is broken. I think that the term defunding the police has really alienated and made such a divide in this conversation that a lot of people are no longer listening. And what I do know is that as long as they are hearing defunding the police, and all of a sudden we're just not going to have police, is really a wedge that opponents are using to distract and further divide us in terms of coming together, as you have so wonderfully said, and being all about the community. Having said that, let me say a few things. With the notion, and I love the concept of reimagining, and Ms. Lewinsky, I hear you, because for so long, over and over and over, we talked about reform. It's almost like we have this house that we know the paint is peeling and the roof is leaking, but we just kind of keep trying to slap a little paint on it, and really we aren't even doing a good job of even trying to slap paint on it. But my point is that until we can, first of all, have a conversation that is rooted in reality. We got to start there. We got to have a conversation that is rooted in reality about what makes sense in a way that we are not being so divisive. Having said that, I think that it is absolutely imperative that we do it differently. and that we have, as everybody keeps saying, accountability. I can give you a quick example because I have seen it from the spectrum of trying to keep children out of the system as a juvenile court judge of one of the largest court systems in the country. And what they kept saying to me is, Judge, you're coddling these kids. I said, no, I'm not. Because I had the lowest, what's the word when you come back? The lowest recidivism rate of single digits. That is unheard of in a major urban city. But it took exactly what we're talking about. It took bringing a community together that became invested in what we were trying to do. So it was the Urban League. It was the NAACP. I mean, the joke was, they were going to block my number because I'm going to call them. I even had a phone put on my bench in the courtroom. I mean, that kind of got to be the joke. But until I could get religious leaders and corporate leaders to buy in, that's how I could get the recidivism rate down to single digits, because I had to make sure that they understood why this was important to their concerns. And so there were people who talked about dollar signs. And I'm saying, but crime, we got to get jobs up, we got to do this. So it's not going to be a quick fix, my brothers and sisters, it's not. But until people understand how it is helpful to them and how they connect to a broader community, we're just going to keep having these same conversations. And I think that that is absolutely essential, and why I'm so grateful that we're having this discussion tonight. Now, I also tell you, though, I don't go on panels where we just talk about the problem. I get calls all the time. I only participate where I know that people are deeply committed about reform and change. If that's not what we're doing, I'm not interested. I hope that's helpful.
No, thank you very much. That is very helpful. And for those who are listening, you have heard a lot of thematics: reimagine, reform, investment. What does it look like to address qualified immunity, a national police registry? We're going to pivot, and I have a few questions that we've gathered from the audience that are directed at panelists. And so I'm going to, throw out these questions and direct it to the panelists who they're for, just to get a sense of, where are we? And so this first question is for Jennifer. The audience members want to know about the bigger picture. How do we actually address the systems that Judge Hatchett just talked about, the economics of it all, jobs, healthcare? What does that really mean when you're talking about reimagining and really fixing the problems we're seeing in policing?
Every big picture is made up of a million pixels. So you can't talk about the big picture unless you're thinking about every single thing that makes that picture happen. When we're talking about defunding police and the fact that most crime comes from a lack of resources, right? Safe communities have resources. I live in a community that is not safe. It is small, but it is not safe. And people don't have resources. Because people don't have resources, there is crime. There's a fair amount of crime. We spend $10 million a year on police and $100,000 a year on social services. Defunding the police means putting resources in place where it will actually prevent crime. Policing does not prevent crime. Policing deals with crime after it happens. So crime prevention looks like giving people resources that we honestly have. We have the resources. We have enough houses that are empty for every homeless person in the country to have 2. We just don't want them to have it. We have enough food to feed every single person in this country every single day, 3 meals a day. We just don't want them to have it. We throw it in the garbage because it's not going to make us any money. We need to reimagine the way that we look at taking care of each other and our communities to prevent crime in the first place. Then we can defund the police because we won't need so many, even though what we're doing currently doesn't work anyway, right? If prison actually served to keep us safer and prevent crime, the country with the most prisoners in the world would be the safest country in the world, and we are not by far the safest country in the world. But we do have the most police and the most prisoners. It's not a working system. What works is for people to have what they need in the first place.
May I just jump in on that for just a quick footnote? Because having seen the criminal justice system at the very kind of front door when kids are getting involved, what things that we know that a child who drops out of school is 3.5 times more likely to have a criminal record as an adult, 7 times more likely to then be on welfare, 7.5 times more likely to have a child who will then drop out of school. And so one of the things that I have said is that you can't, and I think we're saying the same thing, is that you can't fix it unless you understand it. And that talking about policing and criminal justice being reimagined, or however we want to characterize that, has to be not in this isolation. Because if a child was not born healthy and then goes to school and can't learn and then starts becoming a behavior problem and drops out and gets recruited by the gangs and then ends up in courtrooms like mine, then, we see that, or we see the generational kinds of things that keep happening over and over, for your point of lack of opportunity, economic issues. And I always tell them, either we're going to invest in Head Start, or we are going to pay dearly on back end. It costs me more as a chief judge in that court to incarcerate a juvenile for a year. I mean, substantially more, like 5 times more than it would have cost me to pay his or her tuition at the University of Georgia. And that's what I had to go to the legislatures and explain to them, that they have got to help me cut down the faucet, even though they said I was coddling juveniles, that at the end of the day, I could prove that if we did these things, we could at least begin to see a difference in the recidivism rate and the rate of children coming in the system. And I know I'm going on much too long, but my point is that until we are really looking at healthcare and mental health, I mean, too many people are locked up who shouldn't be locked up because they need mental health issues, treatment. We know that drug addiction is an issue that we got to deal with, because too many of us are self-medicating, and that's why we're strung out. And then I say, "Oh, Judge has strung out." I mean we collectively. So my point is that until we look at all of these dynamics, which seems overwhelming, but that's the only way it gets fixed, because otherwise we're putting a finger in the dike and the water will just start coming out someplace else.
No, thank you both for that. I have a question that has come into us for President Williams. How does the community, and how should the community approach fixing the house, fixing the peeling paint, without being at full all-out war with law enforcement? What does that look like?
So we got to continue to have these uncomfortable conversations. We have to get comfortable with uncomfortable conversation. You can't understand me and I cannot understand you if we don't communicate. And so those constitutional rights were given to us so that we can speak up against those injustices. And so community, that are organized and combined has to sit at the table with those legislators, with law enforcement. Law enforcement is supposed to be an extension of that community. The community is the customer. How do we expect them to receive us when we don't respect them or give them their respect? And there's not a mutual trust between one another. So it's a collective bargaining with the community and law enforcement that we all have to sit here and talk to each other to understand the differences. Just because, we say culture eats policy. Just because you're not from our communities and our actions and our idiosyncrasies are totally different, but you have an obligation to understand the people for which you are serving and protecting. So we have to be unified in those, and we have to have, the accountability from all of our stakeholders in our community to come collectively to talk about this, but not just to talk about it, just to create some strategic planning, and actions to how we do this. And again, as we talk about funding, that we know that mental illness is very real in our society, homelessness, drugs, but we have to deal with those ills in our society. You know, in law enforcement, they teach you if you malfunction to remove that source of ammunition because you got to go to the root of it. We have to go to the root of the problems in our communities. And like you say, a child that's hungry, a person that don't have the means and you know, the resources to make those needs met. We have to go to those communities and build and give that community, you know, sustainability so that they can grow and that they can be independent, and we work interdependently, that we can reimagine that this society of all societies are treated fairly and equal by a justice system that is equal to all.
No, thank you for that. That is a word. Now, Jerica, there's some questions that have come in. If we're going to be having these tough conversations, what are the core policy solutions that we need to keep at the center of these conversations from your perspective?
Well, Jamal, I know I listed a lot of them and we've heard a lot of them in this conversation. I definitely put the emphasis on putting community first. And when we're talking about the crisis that we're experiencing in our community with violence and gun violence, one of the things that we really need to do when we're talking about community investment is looking to the community itself to help solve the problems, because we know those closest to the problems are also those closest to the solution. So we should be talking about cure violence. We should be talking about mental health support that is coming from the community and that is focused on that. We talked about it earlier, nationalization, national standards, you know, decertification. You shouldn't be able to go from one jurisdiction and to another and get hired after you've committed egregious misconduct somewhere else or killed someone. So we really need to be looking at these. There are a host of policies, and I really encourage everyone to go to the National Urban League's website, to the NAACP, to the Leadership Conference, LDF. I mean, there are roadmaps and frameworks. It's there. What we really have to do is focus on putting that policy and pushing for it and really turning it into action. So there are many things that we can talk about. But the undergird of all of this is that we have to be honest with ourselves. We really have to have in this country a moment of truth and reconciliation, because we know all the underlying and the root causes and the systemic racism. But if we don't call it out, if we don't acknowledge it, then we're not going to ever be able to move people and move the needle. One of the things that I think is important whenever we're talking about policy is to tell the stories, lift up the humanity of our people, of Black and brown people, of communities of color that have been so often marginalized. Recognize that it's just not someone that quote unquote may have committed a crime or someone that was different or other. But when we saw George Floyd laying on that ground calling out for his mother, I don't know one person that can watch that video and not see the humanity in him. So when we're talking about policies that we need to lift up and push for, there's a menu. We need to do it on the national and state and local level, but we need to have these conversations where we talk about the humanity of our people. The Three-Fifths Compromise made it really clear where this country stands on people of color. And we need to make it very clear to the country of where we need to go.
No, thank you for that. Now, it's 7:55 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, and I'm getting my card pulled by production that says we have to transition. So I want you all to give a good virtual round of applause to Leader Jennifer Lewinsky, Leader and President Linda R. Williams, Leader and SVP Jerica Richardson, and Leader Judge Attorney Glenda Hatchett for speaking truth to power about how we wrestle with policing in this country, address the issues that are all interconnected, find solutions, and really push forward on reimagining. We're going to pivot now to two speakers who are going to talk a little bit about a project that's in motion to really map policing budgets. and that is Clinton Johnson, who is the head of the Racial Equity Group at Esri, and Dr. Ilana Needle, who heads up the Racial Equity Partners connected to and funded by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. I know time is tight, but I'm going to turn it over to you both to really lift up this great project as we celebrate, I think, a critical conversation that we just heard from our panelists. Clinton and Ilana, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jamal. This is a great conversation, and I appreciate the directors, Jamal Watkins, Scott Esdale, all the other organizers of the event to create space for us to contribute to this important conversation. Like Jamal said, my name is Clinton Johnson. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I lead the Racial Equity Initiative at Esri. And if there's anything I can contribute to this conversation, it is this. Technology is used by organizations in every sector, in every branch of government to increase value for stakeholders. Data and analytics are used to inform strategic and operational decisions. Apps and automation enhance operations and improve and deepen impact. Tech helps folks to increase revenues, increase customer satisfaction, and understand the impact of the work that they're doing on those outcomes. And it's time to broaden and deepen the way that tech is used to support community-based organizations, especially those organizations that are focused on racial equity. So we provide a lot of guidance on how you can do this. I'm just going to touch on this first component, which is really something to help address the most compelling challenge of our time: how to apply a robust intersectional racial equity lens to identify inequities in community circumstances and outcomes. So when our families and our communities give us the talk, that conversation that prepares us to survive interactions with police, they tell us how police and others will likely treat us differently because of some combination of how we look, where we come from, our beliefs, our genders. They tell us how this will be different depending on both what neighborhoods we come from and what place we happen to be in at the time. Our families and our communities, they're applying an intersectional racial equity lens to understand past experiences and to really use what they learn to prepare us, the next generation, so that we too can survive police encounters. So the racial equity anchor institutions, like many organizations, are trying to apply a racial equity lens to examine and address disparities. And behind all of this is racial equity root cause analysis. These best practices recognize that inequities in outcomes, like people of color in general and Black people in particular, disproportionately losing their lives in fatal police encounters. Inequities in community conditions and community assets, like over-policing and underfunded schools in Black and Brown communities. These inequities flow from decisions and practices further upstream, from policies and messaging that disproportionately harm people of color, and from budget choices that may fund those efforts. And the goal of this methodology is to address unhealthy streams and to uplift and amplify those decisions and practices that lead to community circumstances that drive positive outcomes. So when we began working with the racial equity anchor institutions to support their efforts to reimagine public safety, we started with data. Many around the country are working to grow the body of data that's available to explore policing outcomes. Today, some jurisdictions share use of force data and police stop data. There's data about the locations of protests, like Black Lives Matter protests. And the racial equity anchor institutions needed some more data to understand upstream policies and decisions. So we collaborated on the design of a survey to learn more about police budgets across the country. And we used GIS to enhance their efforts to identify jurisdictions to include in their initial outreach. So authentically moving towards any kind of research effort like this requires understanding and setting the proper context. This work is about more than data, polygons, and points. It's about people. And we needed to use data to bring an understanding of communities and their experiences into context. We needed to visualize how communities of color are dispersed and in some areas concentrated across the country. So we used demographic layers from Esri's Living Atlas to bring the locations of Black and Brown communities into context. We needed to understand and consider where police encounters with unarmed citizens ended in deaths. So we mapped fatal police encounters to bring those devastating experiences into focus. And the deaths of Eric Gardner in New York, Michael Brown in Missouri, Sandra Bland in Texas, and several others that captured public attention, like Philando Castile, those lives matter. So we mapped their locations, each point a life cut short, and brought them into focus as well. This work also took into consideration the communities galvanized by Black Lives Matter protests nationwide. So we mapped the locations of these public outcries for justice to help bring into focus communities impacted by racial injustices in policing. And of course, it was necessary to understand that distribution of police agencies across the country. So we mapped the data set of law enforcement offices and used the previously mentioned data, all of it, to identify jurisdictions to target. So we combined all that information about human experiences to target our efforts to support the racial equity anchor institutions. And the result was a focused subset of jurisdictions to prioritize. And in this community-focused business of increasing racial justice for communities of color and to help reimagine public safety, the reality is many businesses use GIS and other technology to make pivotal changes that increase revenues and improve customer experience. And that probably sounds like a bunch of useless jargon, but I want you to think about companies that you order products from online and the services that deliver food from your favorite restaurants, and know that government agencies and global organizations have used GIS to literally alter the course of the pandemic. So from supply chain to COVID-19, it's clear that GIS is a tool for transformative change. And it's time for more organizations to use GIS to create a paradigm shift in the way that we fight for racial justice. Alana, did you want to?
Hi, Clinton. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me at the 112th NAACP conference. And thank you so much, Clinton, for that great rundown of the hub and how we got there. I direct a collaborative called the Racial Equity Anchor Collaborative. It includes the following leading racial equity organizations: the Advancement Project National Office, the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum, DEMOS, Faith in Action, the NAACP, National Congress of American Indians, the National Urban League, Race Forward, and Unidos US. Supported by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, we work together to promote racial equity, advance racial healing, and ensure that all children, families, and communities have opportunities to reach their full potential. Together with ESRI, the Racial Equity Anchor institutions are partnering on the launch of a new initiative to survey and track policing budgets in targeted areas around the country, as Clinton showed. The initiative is an effort to aid communities on their journey to better engage with and potentially reimagine what public safety looks like, neighborhood by neighborhood, community by community. 2020 and 2021 presented highs and lows across the country. It has been exhausting for our nation, communities, and families to face the racialized impacts of COVID-19, the concurrent recession, and the horrendous extrajudicial killings we witnessed, which are frankly too many to name, which is an indictment in and of itself. It is almost incomprehensible that the rate of police murders of people of color has maintained itself, despite widespread lockdowns across the nation for many months. In the wake of these killings, the country saw civil uprisings and protests from coast to coast, marking a sea change for race and police relations this year. Having robust transparency and understanding of local law enforcement budgets will arm our communities with the data, analysis, and resources they need to make informed decisions about what investments are most needed to make our communities whole. Police violence is unfolding in real time, and states and localities are facing unprecedented budget issues where they will be forced to make hard decisions on what public investments to make. Arming community advocates with a robust mechanism to compare and contrast different community investments in things like public school, mental health and substance abuse services, restorative justice programs, and police budgets will be the goal of this hub. Thank you so much for having us, and I'm happy to share more information on the hub. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our session has really been filled with powerful insights and powerful leadership and voices. Thank you, Leader Scott Esdale, Linda Williams, Jennifer Lewinsky, Erica Richardson, Clinton Johnson, and Dr. Ilana Needle. Our mission is clear: to leave our community stronger, healthier, and better than when we inherited it. And that means addressing the tough issues, as President Williams said, having the tough dialogue in order to find the policy solutions that are going to make us whole. And now, for those of you who are sticking around for the rest of the convention programming this evening, the next session that's happening in a few minutes is a Black Women Town Hall, a national town hall that will feature Bishop Vashti Murphy McKenzie, Congresswoman Nikema Williams from the great state of Georgia, political strategist Donna Brazil, NAACP Cleveland President Danielle Sidnor, and our good friend Joteka Eby, who is moderating that town hall in that session. But this concludes this session around policing, criminal justice reform, and while we say, keep fighting forward, stay involved, and stay connected, thank you all and have a good night.